Hi, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I am going to teach you how to crochet the Heritage Plaid Blanket. This blanket is available as a free pattern on my website, originallylovely.com, and as a kit with Lion brand yarn. I will have both of these linked below. This throw blanket is designed using a extended single crochet stitch with slip stitch stripes, and the stripes going the opposite direction to create the plaid pattern are made using a surface slip stitch technique that I will show you at the end. This blanket is basically worked in stripes to start, with the opposite stripes added, and then the border and then the fringe on either side. So the yarn that we will be using is Hue and Me from Lion brand yarn in the color Rosewater and Love Song. Rosewater is the light pink, and we are using 9 balls. That is the main color. And then the accent color Love Song, the dark pink, we will be using 4 balls. The hook that you are going to be using is an 8mm crochet hook. This is bigger than the crochet hook recommended for the yarn. So if you are using this pattern and using a different size yarn, you're just going to want to know that you will use a bigger hook than the yarn recommends so that your blanket isn't too stiff or firm. So to begin, we're going to take our main color and just create a slip knot, leaving a little bit of a tail to weave in, and put that slip knot on your hook. So then we are going to loosely want to chain stitches. So if you're following the pattern exactly, you will chain 92 stitches and then 1 turning chain, so 93 stitches total. But I'm going to be showing you a smaller version just so that this tutorial doesn't take too long, and I am going to be working 20 stitches. So 20 and then 1 turning chain, 21 chain stitches. So whatever yarn you're using, if you're making this a baby blanket or using a finer weight or heavier weight yarn, just know that this pattern is worked in a multiple of 12 plus 8. So that's why I'm working 20 stitches. So I've chained my 20 stitches, and now I'm going to chain 1 more for a turning chain, and I'm going to begin my first row. So we're going to be working in the bar behind the chain. So if you look at the chain and then turn it over, there's that 3rd loop that's like a bar just behind the chain. And this will give us a nice chain edge to work in later for the border. So if you look, we're going to skip that first stitch and work into the 2nd chain, the bar behind the 2nd chain. So insert your hook, pull up a loop, yarn over, chain 1, and then yarn over and pull through both of those. So this is an extended single crochet stitch. It's just basically a taller version of a single crochet. So it's not a double crochet, it's not a half double, it's an extended single. So again, pull up a loop, insert your hook, pull up a loop, yarn over, and then chain just on that first loop, and then yarn over and pull through both. So this creates that extended single crochet. Whereas regular single crochet, you would just yarn over and pull through 2 without that chain through the first stitch. This one, you are inserting your hook, pulling up that loop, and then chaining on that first loop, yarn over, and pulling through 2. So you can see it kind of starting to develop. It makes these nice like little bit taller stitches, and then you can see there's these holes that are in it. They're very small, and you can see also that the working into that back bar behind the chain creates that nice chain edge for our beginning row. So again, just working into the bar behind those stitches, extended single crochet. So yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through the first loop, yarn over, pull through both. So continue across this row. Coming up to the end there, you can see, I'm going to show you the last stitch because when I was starting out, I always had a hard time knowing if I made it to the end or not. So you can see there, 1 stitch left, and our final extended single crochet. So now if you hold it out, you can kind of get a good look of the first row. Yours will obviously look quite a bit longer than this, but at this point, I generally will count my stitches just to make sure that I did it all right, and then I don't want to count my stitches throughout or make an entire blanket and find out I was off. So chain 1 and turn, that chain does not count as our first stitch. We're going to be working into the second chain from the hook, which is our first stitch. So once again, insert your hook, pull up a loop, chain one, yarn over, pull through both. So same thing, extended single crochet. We're going to continue that across. We're going to be working in both of the loops across this entire row and throughout the entire blanket. So again, your rows will look quite a bit longer. I'm just showing you kind of a miniature blanket version. If you want to pause here and then catch up to me when you've completed your row, that will be great. So coming up on that final stitch here, you can see again, I'm just going to point out that one, it looks like it's turned a little bit. So it's maybe a little bit harder to see, but that is your last stitch. So you need to make sure you get that one to keep your edges square and your count correct. If you turn it over, you can see that it's very obviously your last stitch. If you ever get caught up on that, just turn your piece over and look at it that way. So insert your hook, work that final extended single crochet, and then you can see we have 2 rows here and it's starting to look pretty nice. So we'll chain 1 and then turn, and we'll continue across just as we did on that last row. You can see the extended single crochet kind of gives this nice like V look to the stitches. I think that normally single crochet stitches look kind of like knots, but this looks kind of like a knit type crochet look. So we're going to continue across in this way 8 rows before we work our slip stitch stripes. So just continue across. You will be working very long rows because these rows are actually the long side of the blanket. It's like worked sideways. So the edges of the rows will be the short edge and this will be the long edge of the blanket. So continue across. Again, we have 8 rows to work. So if you want to pause here and catch up with me when you have completed those 8 rows, that is great. But you can continue across and follow along a bit more. So I didn't mention this earlier, but this pattern is actually available as a kit with Lion Brand yarn. So if you want to purchase the kit, I have a link in my bio. It contains all of the yarn you need to make this blanket, and then you can follow along the pattern as well. So you can see we have 3 rows, and then also you can see here, if my camera focuses, the little holes that are between those stitches, and that's actually where we're going to work the surface slip stitch at the end. So I've completed my 8 rows, and I'm just going to show you here how to count quickly. And then coming up on this final stitch, we're not going to work this final stitch all the way. So you're going to work right until the end. We chain that stitch, and then pulling through the final part of that stitch, we're going to use our accent color. So this will just make it so it's more of a seamless transition. I do this every time that I'm changing colors, basically, unless it is a slip stitch. So then you are just going to chain 1 in that new color and turn your work. And just leave the main color sitting there because we don't need to break that yarn. We'll come back and use it. So now we're going to work a slip stitch across into those main color stitches. Just insert your hook, pull up a loop, and then pull that loop through the first loop to create a slip stitch. You want to work these slip stitches plenty loose because slip stitches don't have as much stretch to them as single crochet and extended single crochet stitches do. So just be sure you keep that stitch very loose and relax. You don't want it to cinch up the blanket or not have stretch in that spot. If you're finding that you're having a hard time keeping it nice and loose, you can actually just go up a crochet hook size to a 9mm or even a 10mm if you're really having a hard time, and that will work out okay for you and keep it kind of the same tension. So coming across to the end there, it's always a little bit harder again to see that final stitch, so I'm just going to show you there, and then that is it. It's the last like obvious V. So you can see our slip stitch kind of creates these nice little V's that go across, if you remember when I showed you the blanket at the beginning. So then we'll chain one and turn, just as we've been doing throughout the whole blanket so far. And then instead of working into that slip stitch that we just worked, we're actually going to be working into the main color stitch again. So into that row below, essentially, even though it's right in front of you, we've already worked in this row, but we're working in it again. The two colors make it look pretty obvious. It's a little harder to get your hook into that first stitch, but it's easier on the other ones. So be sure that you're working across plenty loose, not too loose or you'll drop your stitch, but just keep it relaxed and not too tight so that it doesn't pucker. So insert your hook in both those loops of the main color and then continue to slip stitch across. So the reason that I really like this is because it creates a blanket that is reversible. I don't like it when my blankets look finished on one side and then the other side isn't as pretty or it doesn't look the same. So whenever I design blankets, I try and make sure that they are reversible, just because that's something that I really appreciate in a handmade blanket. So slip stitching across in all of those. Again, just keep it plenty loose. And coming up to the end, that final stitch is pretty obvious because it's in the main color. So you'll know when you have worked that last stitch. So final slip stitch, and then just drop that accent color down. We are actually going to use it again because we're only working 2 more rows in the main color for now. So you can see we have our slip stitch on either side and it looks nice and reversible, kind of like a little knit accent. So grabbing our main color once more, we're going to use that color to chain one and then turn. So now we're actually working into that main color row again. Even though we just did another slip stitch row, we're working into that main color V to just leave those slip stitches looking nice and kind of like an top embroidery. So into both loops of that main color. Again, it's kind of tight on the first one because it's been worked into 3 times now, but it shouldn't be too hard. Just guide it a little extra. Make sure you don't split your hook through the yarn or grab any of the accent color strands. So in through both of those, and then your extended single crochet, again, working that across. It should be a little bit harder to work into and just a little slower, but it shouldn't be too difficult. If it's too difficult, you're working too tight and you might want to go up a hook size on those slip stitch rows. So I'm going to zoom ahead a little bit here because I'm sure you know how to work an extended single crochet here. I'm going to go across and you can pause right now and work these rows if you want to catch up with me in a minute. Just make sure you're working into both of those loops of the main color row, whatever your main color is. So again, it's going to be super obvious when you come to that final stitch because it is in the main color. It might look like you have a little bit of a bump on the side, but that's just from the chain one turning when you are working your accent color stripes, and it won't be obvious when you add the fringe and finish your blanket. So when you're at the end, chain one and turn, and then work back in that extended single crochet again pretty easily. So this is essentially the entire pattern. You're just working rows of extended single crochet and slip stitch and to create a stripe design until you add the surface slip stitches at the end. It will pretty much just be stripes. So coming up to that last stitch, we're going to once again pull through those final 2 loops with our accent color. So carry that up just kind of loosely, relax, not too loose, not too tight across the back. If you do it too tight, it will cause your blanket to pucker. Pull through that final stitch and then chain one and turn. So now we're going to slip stitch across again. Every time we're using the accent color, we're going to be slip stitching while we're working the main part of the blanket. So just insert your hook, pull up a loop, and then pull that loop through. Again, work these stitches nice and loosely so that it doesn't get too tight. Go up a hook size if you need to. and work across into that row. So the pattern is the 8 of the extended single crochet main color, and then an accent stripe, 2 main color again, accent stripe, 2 main color, accent stripe, and then it's that series repeated again. And then at the very end, you'll do 8 more rows of the main color so that it's centered, and that you end with a large stripe of main color each time. So that final stitch, work into it, chain 1 and turn, and then once more we're working into the light pink, so the main color stitches again. So the first one's always a little tight. Just make sure you don't split the yarn or grab strands of the accent color. It will just not look quite as nice. And then slip stitch all the way across. So you will be working very long rows. So again, if you want to pause here and catch up with me, now is a good time. This is a really good pattern to substitute different yarn and hook size. You might just need to swatch. You can make a swatch just as I'm doing your 20 stitches wide with, so you would chain 21 at the beginning, and then you can use any hook size, any yarn, and you can kind of decide how big you'll have your blanket to be from that point. So coming up to the end on that slip stitch, just working into that last stitch, and you can see we have 2 accent color stripes now. So now we need 2 more extended single crochet rows in the main color. So chain 1 in the main color, just to kind of seal that end, and then chain 1, turn, and then we're working into the main color row again. So 3rd time into this row, but it gives it kind of that nice striped embroidery type look. So extended single crochet again across these 2 rows, and then we have 1 more accent color slip stitch row, or 2 more rows, like 1 more stripe to work, and then you will be working 8 more of the main color rows. So coming to that end, very end, we're going to work that final stitch, but remember, don't pull it through all the way. Grab your accent color, pull through those 2 loops, and then turn, chain 1 and turn. And your slip stitch row once more. So on the side, you can kind of see those pieces that we carried up, and those don't matter because when we add the fringe, we will, or the border will like hold those in with our work, or the fringe. That'll be the fringe because it goes like next to the rows, and then the stitches at the bottom and the top will be where the border goes. So working our slip stitches again into each of those. I'm just zooming ahead here because I'm sure you know how to do this part pretty well by now. Just again, remember to do it loosely and keep it from being too tight and puckering the blanket. If it's too tight, you're probably just going to want to take it out and go up hook size. So that final stitch, chain 1 and turn, and then slip stitch back into that main color stitch again. So pretty easy. It's actually a very easy design. I think that the hardest part is actually adding the surface slip stitches at the end, but even that part's pretty simple. I'll show you that here shortly. So coming up to the end of those slip stitch rows, we have that final stitch, and we'll work the final slip stitch. And then you are going to want to cut that yarn. So chain 1 in your main color again, turn, and then that accent color yarn, we're not going to want to carry it over the 8 rows again because it won't have as much stretch. So we're going to want to cut it, weave in that end, and then only carry your accent color yarn over the 3 stripes that are close together. So extended single crochet again, once more into the main color stitches, again, working all the way across. And we're going to work 8 rows of this extended single crochet before we do the 3 accent color stripes again. So I'll pause here or kind of stop here and show you what it looks like. There you can see the strand that we carried up the side. We'll hide those in when we add the fringe. No worries there. And then continue with that extended single crochet. So coming up to the end of that row. Again, just always make sure you get that final stitch or it will kind of throw off your blanket at the end. It'll be harder to count for your slip stitch stripes and it just won't look quite as square. And then extended single crochet back again. So you can see it's starting to form. Yours will look much bigger. This is just like a swatch version. You'll work into each of those and you'll do 8 more or 7 more, so 8 main color rows total, and then your slip stitches again. And we will repeat that 5 times if you're using the same size as me. If you're modifying, you'll just work it until your blanket is your desired width. So if you're all the way done now, on that final stitch, you're just going to cut it and then pull that final loop through. And I'll show you count here. 8 rows are pretty easy to count. And here's like my mini version. At this point, you would do more slip stitch rows, but for the sake of this tutorial, I am going to stop and just do like a miniature version. This blanket is like 5 stripe repeats one way by 7 if you're doing it the same size and yarn as I am. Otherwise, you will repeat it to the width you want. So now we're going to be adding those surface slip stitches into those holes. So again, we're going to use the same crochet hook, but you're going to want to work plenty loose. If you find that you're having a hard time keeping it too loose, go up size. So you can see those little holes between the stitches. Those are what we're going to be working into. It looks like they're a little bit staggered and not quite straight, but once you work it, it evens out in the 2 rows. They kind of like push each other to be straight and you won't feel like they're crooked or staggered when we work them. So we're going to count 8 stitches over. That first little piece is the chain, so don't count that. And then 8 stitches. And we're going to be working between the 8th and the 9th stitch. So insert your hook, and with that accent color again, a new strand of it, you're going to pull up a loop. And then you're going to be holding your yarn, your working yarn, so the yarn connected to the ball, underneath the blanket, and you're going to be picking it up through the hole above between the stitches that you just worked. So insert into that gap right above it and work a slip stitch. Insert it, pull up a loop, pull that loop through the first loop. So then into the next one, you can see it's just right above. You'll know that it's the right spot. The other one, if you're like second guessing which hole you're working into, just look and see the one that's the closest ultimately. And I do stop sometimes and count and make sure I'm still 8 away from the edge or the last row, just to make sure you're on track and you're not going crooked. So holding that under the blanket, you're just going to insert your hook into that hole, pull up a loop, and then pull through that main loop. So you're going in through the biggest hole. You want to make sure you're not like splitting a main color stitch or going through it at all. You're just pulling up a loop through that large gap. So you can see here our slip stitch row is looking nice and straight, and it will straighten out even that little bit more. But then at this point, I always count and make sure that I'm not too far away from the edge and like 7 stitches or 9 stitches, just that I'm still 8 stitches away from the edge. And then, so at this point, we're actually going to almost like skip over that slip stitch accent color stripe and just go into the hole for the main color. So insert your hook, pull up a loop, again, another slip stitch. This is a little bit more to handle when you're working the full blanket, and it's a little awkward, but you really do get the hang of it. So if you're feeling like this part is difficult, just keep going and you will get used to it. The first couple rows are the hardest, and then it gets pretty easily and goes fast. And it's really fun when you can start to see the plaid forming. So continuing up just nice and loose. You don't want to cause the blanket to pucker. And you can see here, just double check again that you're 8 away from the edge, and then that's the chain. So ignore the chain stitch. That the turning chain doesn't count as a stitch. And you can see it is still stretchy, so that means I'm using the right tension. If yours isn't stretchy at this point, you're probably going to want to take it out and go up a hook size. Another thing to make sure your tension is good is just to always pull that loop all the way back to the widest part of your hook. So, because that's the part of the hook that is the 8mm, whatever size you're using. So then you know each of your loops is the same thickness or width. So that final one, we've pulled through the loop there. And then while you could go over, and I did that at first, and then I decided that this technique works a little bit better to make it less bulky on the edge, is just insert that hook underneath into that final hole, grab that loop, and then pull it through. And then so we're going to turn over our blanket and we're going to work back down the other direction. And this is easy because we're using those strands underneath as a guide for our holes. So you can see here, you want to work into the exact same hole that you worked into before when you were working the other direction. So make sure you don't like split the yarn, split that stitch at all. You want to go into the exact same hole. So you're going to insert your hook and then pull up a loop and then pull that loop through the first loop on your hook. And I showed you that direction so you can kind of visualize it like going back down the other direction. But I turn my blanket at this point so that I'm working up once again, just because I feel like that's easier to manage and maneuver. So just work into the same side of those stitches, the exact same hole and the same side each time. So I'm working on the right here. I do switch to the left. Don't do that. Either work into the right of each stitch or to the left, but into that exact same hole. So you can see that bar is kind of next to the slip stitch, but when it is like kind of moved around and if you block it, it just actually covers it up because those slip stitch V's like want to sit on top of the work and they'll just cover that third bar that's going past and you won't even notice. So into that exact same hole again. So you can see here I do switch to the left. Don't do that because then that bar will cross over the V and it just won't look quite as precise. I didn't notice I did that until I was editing this video. But just be sure to work into that exact same hole and to on either the right or the left side each time back up. So down the other side of the slip stitch, surface slip stitch row that you created. If you split through that stitch and don't go through the exact same hole, it will also not look quite right. It'll just look better if you go through the same hole on the same side each time. Again, keeping it nice and loose. It's a little awkward, but it's worth it because this is the part that makes your blanket look plaid. And I like this technique because really there's no easy way to crochet or knit plaid, but everyone wants to. And this way is probably the easiest that I've found just because I'm only holding one strand at a time. So I'm actually pretty happy with this technique that I came up with because I think it looks really cool. So you can see your row. We have that first one completed. So now we're flipping it over again. And to like secure that little end, we're going to pull that loop loose, like pull it out quite a bit. And then we're going to just put the whole ball of yarn through that loop. If this was like at the end of a blanket, we would cut it and pull it through. But since we're going to be using that strand again, we're just going to pull the ball through and then pull it not tight, but just like at an even tension to secure. So you can see those V's, like some of the bars are sticking out to the side of those V's. Once you work and just keep going and then block your blanket, if you steam it at the end or even just use it, those will work their way underneath that V and not be obvious. So now we're counting 2 stitches over from that column and we're going to work another surface slip stitch row. So 2 stitches over, we pull up a loop in that first row, just as we did with the last surface slip stitch row and pull up a loop, pull through. So you can see we have 2 stitches between each of those. This is where it starts to get easier because you don't really have to count. 2 stitches is a lot easier to tell the difference than, or to notice, than 8 stitches from the edge. So when you're only working 2 away from the last one, I feel like it goes a lot faster and a lot easier. So continuing across, just pull up a loop into each of the row above the one you just worked into, working nice and loosely. You are working your surface slip stitches once more. So again, this does get easier as you go along, and you can kind of start to see it forming, which is definitely fun. It definitely forms quickly, and it's just like that finishing touch. It really brings it from plaid, or from stripes to plaid quickly. So into that final row there, and then remember we insert that hook and pull that loop back into the back of the work. And then we're going to flip it over again. So there is, because like your working yarn is now going over that row to the back, it is like over the edge of those stitches, but that's why we add a border to cover that, and it just keeps it so that we're working only with 1 strand of yarn and fewer ends to weave in, which is always better than a lot of ends to weave in. I think pretty much everyone doesn't like doing that. So continuing into the exact same hole, into the same side each time, and going back is easier because again, you can use that bar behind the slip stitch as a guide each time. Just go slowly, make sure your tension is loose and even, and we'll go up that entire row. So if you're working this exact same blanket, you will be working, so it was 5 repeats of 3 accent color stripes, and then in the other direction, so these stripes, we're working 7 repeats of 3 stripes like this if you're creating the same size blanket I am. Otherwise, you can modify this to really be whatever size. So that final loop, remember we just loosen it up and then pull the ball of yarn through, and don't tighten it like super tight, just kind of like a relaxed tightness. And then that piece of yarn, that strand of yarn goes across, but that's not a big deal because this is where we'll hide that in when we make the border. So 2 stitches over again, we're going to work that 3rd slip stitch stripe going up, and you're probably starting to get pretty good at this now. So I'll zoom forward a little bit here if you want to pause and catch up with me. So coming to that end, I'm just going to show this part once more because it is kind of important. It makes it look quite a bit better and less bulky. So go through the back, pull that loop through to the back of the work and flip it over. And then make sure it's not too tight, and then go into that next row again. And then it's just that 1 strand of yarn going over the edge. It's a lot less bulky and just kind of more concise and looks a little bit neater. So crocheting down that row again and coming to the end. So we pull through and then pull through that ball of yarn. You're actually going to cut this strand and then weave in that end. Only carry across when you're working the rows that are next to each other, because going across the entire 8 rows, it's hard to get the right tension and the right stretch. So it's best if you only carry when you're working rows that are very close to each other. So you can see now that the plaid has formed pretty quickly, and the next step is to work the border on that row. So it's the row with the V's. If you're kind of confused which side is which, just look at the V. That's the chain row. It's not super focused, but you can see on your own work. So with that same size hook and our accent color yarn again, we're going to pull up a loop in that corner, in the very corner. So you want to make sure that, so we're actually in the first stitch there. If you look, there's like 2 holes kind of. I'll show you here. you want to go into that very corner space so that you can work a single crochet into that first corner, and just again keep that corner nice and square. I think it always looks best when the blankets are very square. So pull up that loop, chain 1, and then single crochet into that first stitch. So now if you look, you can see that that first stitch has a single crochet, whereas otherwise it wouldn't. It would be kind of like a curved edge. So now single crochet into each of those stitches across. We're just working a plain single crochet, not an extended single crochet. So it's just insert your hook, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through both of those. There's that no chain on the first stitch, and just work nice and loosely in each of those stitches. Single crochet, you don't have to worry about doing it quite as loose as slip stitch, but still, just you don't want that blanket to pucker. So on this stitch, just make sure if you move that little bar over, you can kind of see, look for the V in the main color, and then you'll know. And actually I didn't carry that strand or hide it in, so I'm going to take out those 2 stitches and show you what I mean with that. So that bar that I carried across, that strand, just insert in that as well, that strand and the stitch, like that. Pull up a loop, single crochet, do that into the next stitch as well, and then that hides that yarn that you carried across in the border, which is really nice. You know, fewer ends to weave in, and it's actually one of the reasons that I did the border in an accent color, so that it hides that strand extra well, because with the main color it would probably poke through since it's lighter. So continuing across, just single crochet into each of those stitches. And this border, it's not a true border because we're only going one direction, and then on either edge, like next to the rows, we're going to be adding fringe. You could go all the way around if you wanted, but I think this way looks the best. So into that final stitch, and then turn. Do not chain 1, you just turn. So we're going to be working a slip stitch now. So into that stitch we just worked, slip stitch. And again, since slip stitches are tighter, you're going to be wanting to work this nice and loose, nice and relaxed, just because they don't have much stretch. So insert your hook, pull up a loop, pull through that first loop nice and loosely, and just across in this one direction. And then we'll repeat this on the opposite side. So the 2 sides next to this border will be left for the fringe, and then the side opposite this will be worked in the same way, just to conceal those edges, the yarn that we carried, and give it a nice polished edge. So that final stitch, we will cut that yarn and leave a little bit of a tail, and then yarn over, pull through. And then here, actually, I'm going to blend that in as a piece of fringe because it's just 2 fewer ends to weave in, and because this yarn's kind of bulky, weaving in the ends does add a bit of extra bulk. So you can see there that the border did really hide those strands that go across very well. It looks nice. And to work this border piece, I'm just going to, or this piece of fringe with those 2, I'm just going to do a single knot around those, not pull it too tight, but try and get it to as close to that stitch as I can. And then it'll blend in with the fringe nicely. Even though I'm not tying the fringe that way, it'll look good. And then wait to cut those edges until you have all the fringe, so you can cut them all at one time, make them all the same length. So now for the fringe, you're going to want to cut a lot of strands of yarn. I generally do 10 inches each, and I'm just going to show you with a couple because it's pretty repetitive. So into the sides of the row. So don't overthink it too much because they do stagger, like depending on which side of the row it was, if you were like going down or back, but it really is just that first hole next to it. And that's kind of why you use the same color as you did for the body of the blanket, because if we were using the dark purple for this fringe, it would kind of not look super straight across right there. So using the same color makes it look just a little bit more cohesive. So insert your hook into that first space and pull up a loop in the middle of your strand of yarn and pull through both tails. You're going to repeat this across, working each row in the main color, and then when you come to the accent color slip stitch stripe, you'll work it in the accent color. So every now and then you have an accent color piece of fringe that kind of looks like it just went down like a woven blanket would. So tighten those up once you have them all in, and then cut them at the same length. I wait until I'm done to fully tighten them, and then you can see that how it will start to form. And you'll repeat this on either side. You'll do the border on either side, and then you'll have your ends to weave in, and then you will be finished. That is everything. I hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know if you have any questions, and be sure to subscribe if you want to see more of my videos. Thanks so much.